worked out. So it's always a pleasure to be able to get that accomplished. And fortunately, even if we're in a virtual setting like this, we're still going to be able to share some good information. So big thanks to you guys in Texas AgriLife for having me back today. For those of you that may or may not have seen me speak before or heard me speak before, my main goal is just simply to show you some things that maybe you haven't seen before, and maybe show you some tools that you can put in your risk management toolbox during times of drought, like what we're seeing right now, that can help you weather the storm, and in some cases be profitable going forward. So from a weather standpoint, that's what I'm going to be sharing with you today. And I know there are a lot of us in the Southwest United States right now that are struggling mightily because of the drought situation that's going on. And that's what this first map kind of gives you an idea of. It's very similar to what the Drought Monitor deals with, but we're talking about long-term regional drought that's really got a footprint taking place here across the southwestern United States. And you can see where some of the worst drought is confined into western Colorado, a large portion of Arizona, and obviously into New Mexico and far west Texas. So with that in mind, those are the areas that are obviously seeing the worst of it right now. And the farther east you get, things gradually get better. And where they get better, they get a lot better, where they're not having any drought to deal with. So again, the farther west you live, it's definitely not ideal in terms of, moisture situation is concerned, nor has it been really ideal for a while. And you can track that back to about the past 60 days or so, where you can see who's been seeing moisture and who hasn't been seeing moisture. And it's the same areas that have been fairly dry. The southwest mountains of Colorado, the San Juans up in the north central New Mexico have been parched. They've missed out on monsoon seasons now for the past 2 years. We obviously dealt with a lack of snowfall a couple of years ago. We're dealing with lack of snowfall down there right now. This is long-term drought that the longer it persists, the harder it is for it to actually break down. And you can see for folks in Southwest Texas there, that's really about a couple of storms, and that's been about it. And they've actually lucked out versus New Mexico has really had a hard time, and on up into the panhandles and also into southeast Colorado and southwest Kansas. So it's largely been the haves and the have-nots, and unfortunately a large part of the Southwest has been underneath the have-nots. And if you think that's bad, well, just go out into California, and they had a fire hose of a storm that was going on out there back in January, and you could see that they are still struggling mightily. In fact, much of the Sierras and up into north central California are seeing extremely dry conditions, and I don't see that changing a whole lot in the near term. And I'll talk some about that as we get deeper into this presentation. The long-range forecasting has a lot to do with sea surface temperatures, the anomalies of those, and how they're kind of stacked across the overall globe. And I know if you've been dealing with weather, like I have, farmers and ranchers know about La Nina and El Nino, and you know that we've been yapping about La Nina now for quite some time. And that's the look of a La Nina right there. You see all that blue and green shading out in the central Pacific Ocean that extends back over to the west coast of South America. And that's indicative of a La Nina episode, a moderate La Nina episode at that. This is a little different animal though. And the reason it is because a large part of the North Pacific is actually warmer than average right now. And that kind of bucks the trend when you're talking about a La Nina episode that's been developing now for quite some time. Now, the North Pacific has cooled off somewhat, but it's still remaining above average in terms of temperature. So if you remember the La Nina episode that happened back in late 2010, 11, and off and on through parts of 12 and 13, overall, the whole Pacific was pretty chilly, and that includes the North Pacific. And that's when I really get bothered by multi-year, multi-stage regional type of drought. And the fact that we don't exactly have that type of a setup doesn't necessarily put my mind at ease because of the situation that we're dealing with right here, but it also puts my mind at least a little bit at ease. It suggests maybe we won't be as bad as those 3 to 4 years that were so rough across the southwestern United States and down into Texas and on up into parts of the western high plains. So this map, far from ideal, just not what it was back in that period of time where we dealt with such awful drought across the region. This is the sea surface temperature anomaly animation from back in November. And you can see that the blues right there uh, indicate water temperatures that are cooler than average. And you can see that that cool signal has weakened a little bit here within about the past couple of weeks. Does it mean that it's going away? Well, if you look at just the surface, you might get an indication that that might be the case. So while you're looking at that, let's look beneath the surface, and we'll show you a little bit different animal here as far as what we're looking at. Ocean depth, top to bottom here on the map. And then on the left side of this graph, it's off the northeast tip of Australia. On the right side, it's on the west coast of South America. So we're going top down in the ocean all the way down 450 meters, and then we're going across the equator here. And where you're seeing the warmer than average water, you see all the reds and the oranges on the left-hand side, that's over in the far West Pacific. And then where you're seeing the blues, some of those blues are down to 200, 225 meters deep. So when you have colder than average water stacked that deep, it doesn't really lend itself to saying, well, this La Nina episode is going away. It's going to take some time for that water to kind of go back toward neutral and actually warm back up again, especially if you look what lies beneath it over here. You don't see a gangbusters warm pool that's immediately beneath that cold pool. If we had that, I'd be a lot more encouraged about this La Nina episode rapidly going away. I just don't think it's rapidly going to go away. I think we may have peaked, but I don't think it's going to go away. And because here we are already in late winter, fixing to roll into spring, having a La Nina episode that's still organized during the springtime, again, is far from ideal when you're trying to break a drought or get some late winter snowpack or early winter snowpack going for those areas that are seeing the drought. So that kind of gives you an idea of where I sit as far as this La Nina episode right now and kind of where we're going. Now, these are the computer models. Just grabbed this yesterday. All of those squares and circles on the right side are various computer models that are looking at the same thing. They're looking at whether or not we're going to see this La Nina episode continue, or we could go to El Nino. Well, if you look, we've got one of those models that's way up there at the strong El Nino. We've got a couple of them that are down there below that are in strong La Nina territory. And then we have a lot of them that are just kind of middle of the road. So I think the safest bet going forward, especially from what I just showed you with that last graphic, is that we're just slowly going to weaken this La Nina episode. However, I'm kind of pessimistic that it's going to go completely away, even as we get into summertime. We may come back toward neutral, but we may still flirt with some cooler than average water out there, which again is not necessarily ideal if we're trying to break things up. And there's time for this to change. There absolutely is. But if you go back to what I was just saying a second ago with the cooler than average water that again is deep, down to about 200 meters, that doesn't give me a whole lot of confidence in suggesting that we're rapidly going to diminish this La Nina. So I hope that makes some sense there, kind of where I'm leaning. If we look at some longer term trends here, okay, and I know this is a lot to digest, but that's kind of what I'm all about, throwing this stuff at you. What you're looking at right here is the Pacific Decadal Oscillation Index. All right, now in the Pacific Ocean, there are different phases of the ocean. There's a warm phase or a positive phase, and a cool phase or a negative phase. And it changes about every 25 to 30 years. So I took you all the way back to 1860 with this. During times when the Pacific is in this colder state, we usually struggle mightily in terms of getting regular moisture or storms that are more frequently moving through that can produce moisture. When the Pacific Decadal Oscillation is positive or in its warmer phase, we seem to struggle a whole lot less. So if you look at where we've been, just go back to the year 2000 here, okay, or around 99. Since about 99, we've had a lot more cooler phases of the Pacific than we've had warmer. Now, we've had some better years in there, but in general, I think it's pretty safe to say that for the past 20 years, we've had to deal with more drought than not. And I know you guys as producers would probably say the same thing. Well, I think you have to look no further than right there as to the reason why. We can also chart things back into the 50s. If you go to the 50s, you see that there's some big blue spikes there where we had to deal with massive drought. You can go back to in parts of the late teens, right before 1920, and really bad stuff back there before the turn of the century, back in the late 1880s, or the late 1800s, from about, say, the late 1870s through about 1900, it was awful in terms of drought. Now, I'm not saying that we're reliving that right now. And I know we have better ways to deal with drought now than what we did. But I do think it's safe to say that during the past 20 years, when we've had to deal with more drought than not, I think that's a pretty accurate statement. And we can chat about this here after I'm done if you think that that's inaccurate, and we'll discuss it. But my main goal when I'm talking to ag producers is looking at this graph and showing them that when we know that there are going to be periods of time where this PDO is in a negative or a cold phase, you have to have a drought plan and you have to have it executed to a T. Because if you don't have that, you're going to be behind the 8 ball and you're going to be losing money hand over fist. Now, that being said, it's also my job to figure out when the other side of this coin is going to play. So if we're going to have an El Nino, if we're going to have a wet year, those are the years that we could really make hay. And I see those years as being fewer and farther between. We already farm and ranch in a desert as it is. So when we stack the deck against us with something like this, when we get a PDO that's in a cold phase like we are right now and contributing to that drought, we need all the help that we can get. So I hope that makes some sense what I'm talking about right there, because the Atlantic has its own phase. So what you're looking at here is the Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation. Again, it oscillates about every 25 to 35 years. You can see that its period of oscillations here are a lot more defined than what the PDO was. But since about 95, we've been in a state of positive AMO. All right. So if you go back from around 1960 to about 1995, about a 35-year period there, you can see that that was the last cold period. So we've been going on now for about 25 years. I would say that we're probably fixing to see this AMO flip to a colder state. Now, again, this is far from a perfect roadmap. We're talking about really just a snapshot in time, just going back to 1860, all right? But you can see those definitive patterns right there, and someone's got to figure them out. Someone's got to pay attention to them, and there are a lot smarter people that do it than I do, or than I am. But this is kind of what my niche is, and taking some of this stuff and breaking it down into lay terms and making it make sense to you so you can actually use it to benefit. So you might be asking yourself, well, what does our drought frequency look like when a PDO's in one phase or an AMO's in another? Well, I'm glad you asked, because that's what this next slide is all about. So where we are right now is in the lower right, all right, where we've got a negative PDO right now and a positive AMO. And where you're seeing the reds, that's where drought frequency is enhanced. Where you're seeing blues, that's where drought frequency is reduced. And so if you look at that map, well, it's no wonder the Southwest United States is dealing with drought, simply because drought frequency is higher than usual when we have the ocean stacked the way that we do. It doesn't mean everybody's in a crippling drought. It just simply gives us an idea of where the drought frequency is going to be the highest with this particular setup. Now, the really good times, all right, is when the PDO is positive. So you look at the top two right there, and when we have a PDO that's positive, most of New Mexico and the Southwest US does okay, especially when the Atlantic cools down somewhat. So that's the trend that we have to watch going forward. When this drought breaks, what is the Atlantic going to do? What is the Pacific going to do? What type of phases are we in, and where are we going forward? I think that to figure that stuff out, you're really holding the golden ticket to drought management, because if you have 10, 12 month lead time on a drought, which is kind of what I gave my clients last year about this particular drought, you can make a lot of hay during that period of time if you know something. You can do that if you know it's coming 6 months ahead of time, or at least make the necessary preparation so you can weather it the best that you can. So drawing these two things together and really pinpointing in terms of drought frequency, I think is a really important thing to us. Whether you're farming or ranching in the Western High Plains or the Southern Plains, or certainly here in the Southwest, that's something we need to look out for. So in terms of where we're going with model forecasts here, I want to show you this first model. This is the NMME model, which is the North American Multi-Model Ensemble. It's an ensemble of 10 different models looking at the same thing. And what I'm showing you here are precipitation trends. So green, blues, those are the wetter than average ones. white is generally average, and then the brown is the drier than average. So you could see who is supposed to be in the drier than average category here during the month of March. Conversely, you look at the Pacific Northwest and you're doing okay. So if you look at that right there, all right, take a little bit of a snapshot. I'm going to go back one slide and show you where that drought frequency is enhanced. So you look at us here on the lower right, you see where it's supposed to be dry, and lo and behold, you look at a computer model and it's showing drier than average conditions. So to me, that's a pretty good signal of kind of what's going to happen going forward. Now, the real tell here is, well, are we not going to have storms at all? No, we are going to have storms come through. That's not the issue. The issue is getting those storms to come through in such a way where they're going to be beneficial instead of just producing the stupid wind. I really think that's what this boils down to. So we know the wind cranks up in March and April as well as May, and we're headed toward that time. And right now, I'm fairly pessimistic in terms of seeing any type of significant moisture during the month of March. This is the month of April, and you can see what that really stout dry signal does. It actually starts to move a little farther north and actually bullseyes western Kansas in eastern Colorado. But again, it's pinpointed in pretty much the same spot that it should be with the way the oceans are stacked right there. So March and April, not looking very ideal, at least with this particular model. If we go to May, it's kind of the same story, but that should be the way it is. Drought begets drought. Drought feeds on drought. It is the most god-awful positive feedback mechanism in the atmosphere that there is, because the longer the soil stays dry, the more it heats up. The more it heats up, the drier it gets. The warmer and drier it is, the more the atmosphere stirs up, which cranks up the wind. And then you have the wind, which further dries it out even more. You see where I'm going with this, all right? So where it's drier than average right now and where that drought is severe, chances are it's probably going to stay that way, especially with the way things are stacked and the way the models look going forward. Now, if we look at June, you can see that the dry signal starts to relax a little bit. And this is important because if you look down there in Mexico, you see where the greens and the blues are that are creeping northward, and that's an indication of the start of the monsoon season. Well, like I said, we've largely failed the past two monsoon seasons. So we need one of those big monsoon seasons to really kind of get us off the schneid, if you will, here as far as drought goes. And where you see the dry signal lessening there in Arizona during the month of June, that's at least a little better sign. And then you come into July and you see it be completely erased right there. Not that the drought would be erased by any stretch of the imagination, but if at least we can get some monsoon flow going and some better thunderstorm producing days, that would go a long way into helping things out, because you know those monsoon rains can be big rain producers. Slow moving thunderstorms that can produce 4, 5, 6 inches of rain over a period of time. I know we'd have some flooding to deal with, but that's how we roll. We are largely feast or famine. And I think a lot of us would take a whole lot of feast based on where we've been dealing with here with the dryness. So even into the month of August, okay, so if we can kind of turn the corner here after we get past May and get some monsoon action going on here with the way some of the models are suggesting, that would at least put us in a better spot. Now, I want to qualify that by saying, statistically speaking, you know as well as I do, the farther you go out in weather forecasting, the less accurate it is. All right, that's just a simple, fair statement to make. So you still have to take that with a grain of salt, whether or not we're going to have a monsoon or not, simply because we have a drought to get through first, and we have to change the weather pattern that's producing that drought before we can even begin to talk about getting a monsoon in here. So that's model number one right there. The other model that I want to show you, it draws a very similar parallel here in terms of the precipitation trends. This is a European seasonal model. The color scheme's pretty much the same. You know, brown's the bad, green and the blue is the good. And this is the March forecast for it. So it's got drier than average conditions across New Mexico, Arizona, large part of Colorado, large part of Texas. But again, it's in that spot that's supposed to be drier than average with the way things are stacked up right now. If we go to April, it's the same story. But again, much like the previous model that I showed you, the drier than average signal was starting to extend farther north. And kind of bullseyes areas right there in the Four Corners area, Utah, Colorado, Arizona, and New Mexico. So that's April. This is the month of May. I'm really not sure what that green is doing there in the Texas Panhandle, sandwiched between two pretty stout dry signals right there. I'm not sure what the model is looking at. I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm just saying it just doesn't look like it makes a whole lot of sense why something would be wedged in there instead of, over a more wide area right there. So I would stand to say that there's a better than average chance of March, April, and May being drier than average across New Mexico and a large part of the neighboring area. Now, here's the June caveat again. You see where the greens and the blues are making northward progress out of Mexico into eastern Arizona and western New Mexico. It's not great because not everybody's seeing that moisture, but it's at least a trend that is showing up now on two models. I could have shown you another model as well that was showing it up there as well. So there's at least a little bit of consistency there with this. And if we go into July, then the monsoon you see is a little bit more prolific. It extends northward up into Colorado. The problem with the monsoon and the problem with why I don't want to put all my eggs in the basket of a monsoon is simply because it really depends on where this ridge of high pressure sets up. If it sets up over West Texas or over where the driest part of the soil is, it's going to divert a lot of that monsoon moisture too far to the west. All right, we need that to set up farther east. We need that high to set up over about Dallas or over the Arklatex, so we can bring that moisture up over the entire area instead of limiting it to some very localized areas that are situated a little bit farther to the west. So that's a trend that I'm going to have to look for in the upcoming model runs to see just kind of where we're pinpointing. But I will say this, that ridge of high pressure usually sets up where it is the driest in terms of the soil. And you know as well as I do, they've been seeing moisture farther east. So if I had to just lay money down right now and say, well, does that ridge have a better shot of setting up over the Arklatex or over West Texas? I would say the way things are stacked right now, it's got a better shot of setting up over West Texas, which would, again, divert that better monsoon moisture farther west. But at least there's a little bit of hope right there in some of the model data. And then into August, you can see we start to do a little bit better in terms of monsoonal flow, at least being a more persistent tap coming out of Mexico and being a little bit more beneficial right there. So I'm not saying July and August are perfect on either model. I'm just simply saying they look a whole lot better than where we are as far as the spring is concerned. And that's unfortunate if we do miss out on the monsoon, because that's a lot of times that's where we get our best rains that can set us up as far as subsoil moisture goes, and we can grow some late summer grass if we need to, and really do some good things as far as the weather goes. That's kind of my message tonight here, folks. For those of you that have reached out to me, and like I said, I've been talking with Bruce for years now, and I think Bruce can attest to this. If you've got a question, I want you to ask it. And if you've got a question after we're done here, I want you to ask it. I want you to put my email to use. I want you to hit me up on Twitter. That's my Twitter handle right there. And I talk to a lot of desert farmers and ranchers, via Twitter. And I do a lot of private forecasting for a lot of various interests around. So if you need weather for your biz, just simply hit me up for a quote. We'll sit down and talk it. I'm very negotiable with this kind of thing because agriculture runs very deep in my blood. And I grew up in a farming and ranching family in the Western High Plains. And I put myself through college running cattle in that. So I kind of know the ins and outs of what that's all about. So in terms of weather, that's my message to you folks today. Making it make sense to you, showing you some things that maybe you can use going forward. And I will say this about this long range forecast business. I know a lot of folks don't think us weather guys know anything, that it's just pure guesswork. Well, you know what? Future's hard business. Just ask anybody that's in economics. And if the future wasn't hard, we wouldn't be having this conversation today because everybody would be invested in Bitcoin, making money hand over fist, not doing a thing. So I think we have to look at it that way. And then when you're looking at long range forecasts, we're not trying to run the bases, to use a baseball analogy. We're just simply trying to get in the ballpark and make it make sense so you have an idea of where the weather patterns are going forward and you can make some decisions. Now, if I want to open the floor up for questions, let's go ahead and do that, guys, if you want to.
All right, great. Thank you, Brian. And yeah, Marcy and Jason, if you guys can kind of monitor the chats and log in and or log on here, I guess, and kind of read the questions to Brian, that'd be great.
So
And
one of the initial questions that came in, Brian, was, I think it was back to your first slide that you started with, if you could explain that color coding system that you had used.
The very first slide of the presentation.
Yes, sir. If I remember correctly.
Let me get out of that and go back just so we can bring it up here.
Okay.
If I can. Back, it won't let me X out, so I'm just going to back up here. And I think that was probably the equivalent to the drought monitor, if I remember correctly.
Yes, sir. Yes,
that was it. Basically, let me get out of this.
I think they were percentile numbers.
Yes. Here we go. Here we go. Let's just bring this up. We'll bring it up again.
Yep, that's the one.
Yep. Okay. So in terms of drought, all right, when you're looking at the percentile over there, going from a D0 all the way to a D4, you can see most of New Mexico right there is in that D3. Well, there's nothing higher than D4. All right, so we're talking about severe to exceptional drought in that, and climatologists as well as insurance companies and government entities use this type of classification to also do drought relief programs or make the disaster declarations. So in terms of our long-term drought indicator, as well as the drought monitor, that's kind of what they are used for with this. But so where you're seeing the bright reds and then those dark reds, that's really about as bad as it gets as far as drought is concerned. And conversely, you look at where the greens and the blues are, and of course, that's where it's, they've had more moisture and they know what to do with.
No, I appreciate that explanation. There, a couple questions came in on some definitions for some abbreviations that you used and showed up on the slide. So PPO value and AMO value. Okay, so the PDO, and I'll bring that slide up here as well. The PDO is the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. Okay. So when you see the PDO reference, that's what it is right there. So that's the long-term Pacific Decadal Oscillation Index all the way back to 1860. And then the AMO is the Atlantic Multi-Decadal Oscillation. So again, these are oceanic oscillations that go back and forth and change about every 25 to 35 years. Okay, and related to that, there was a question about whether or not those decadal maps can be easily found through NOAA so that an individual producer or rancher could go on and monitor those as they would change moving forward. Well, they don't update them as frequently as I would like them. So you're talking about our government here, and I'll be real honest, the government hasn't put a whole lot of energy into weather and climate for about the past 20 years. So is there any reason that would stand out to make me believe that they would change that? No, not right out of the gate, especially when we're doing trillion-dollar stimuluses. I don't think weather is probably in those, much to my dismay. But you can always hit me up for them, and I can look and kick you a link to know how to find them. Just use my email if you're interested, and I can help you out with that as well. And then another question was, the theme is that it seems like it's going to continue to be drier than normal, and I know you probably don't want to put your thumb out there on specific numbers, but if you had to guess in terms of a percentage of normal precipitation in this this New Mexico and West Texas and Texas Panhandle region? You have anything in your bag?
Well, I have a real hard time with normal or average in the Western High Plains, because to me, normal is you get an awful lot of rain and then you don't get any rain, and you divide by 2, and that's a number nobody ever gets anyway. So that's kind of how I define average and normal. Now, in terms of, do I think you're going to have some moisture that you can actually do something with that will help break this drought? Again, I would say that as this La Nina weakens, but may not completely go away, but as it weakens, our prospects of seeing a monsoon season do look better than they have over the past couple of years. So if my family, well, and I have been giving advice to my family, and they're looking at this type of setup, I would say, it'd probably be a good idea to plan on the first half of the summer being dry, and the second half of the summer at least being not as dry. I'm not going to say it's going to be wet. I'm just simply saying the second half of the summer probably stands a better chance of seeing moisture than the first does, the way I see it now.
Okay.
I hope that makes sense.
No, it does, definitely, to me. And those of you, if you have more questions, I don't know what we're looking like in terms of time, Craig, but if we need to move on, just let me know. There was a question that came across for that slide that it's currently on, back to this PDO and AMO concept. Brian, those colors, red is drier, and blue is wetter, correct?
That's right. Yeah, and I need you to think of it as, if you see at the bottom, 25% equals normal drought frequency. Okay, so now my family lives in eastern Colorado. So if you look at those 4 maps, you're like, well, hell, it's going to be a drought 75% of the time over here. That those odds aren't too favorable odds for us. But if you're farming and ranching in northeast New Mexico, you're kind of in the same ballpark there as well. So yes, the red is enhanced drought frequency. The blue is reduced drought frequency. And the biggest telltale sign that I can tell you is that when the Pacific is in a warm phase, we usually don't have to worry about a whole lot of moisture. And the same thing could be said when the Atlantic gets into a cooler phase, man. It's just when we are negative PDO and we are positive AMO that it's less than ideal for a large part of the Southwest. And, you look at that map on the lower right there, and you could pretty much draw it up to a T from that map who's seeing the worst dryness right now. I know there are some exceptions as far as the eastern extent of that and the northern extent of it, but it's pretty good bullseye right there.
No, thank you. Thank you very much for those answers. And I enjoy it every time I get to hear you speak. So I appreciate you being part of the program. Any other questions that anyone has that haven't come in yet? Marcy, have you seen anything come in that I've missed?
Well, the ultimate crystal ball was, what do you foresee in 2022? And are we leading into, so this is a combination of a couple questions, forecast for 2022, and are we looking at a mega drought?
Well, a mega drought being classified as it's been drier than average since 2000? Because you talk to a lot of folks, that'd be a definition of a mega drought.
Well, I think that the crystal ball is, is this pattern going to continue for producers to prepare for that? But specifically, we had thoughts on 2022.
My take on this, and I spoke to some folks in Western Kansas last week, and I'm going to speak to another group this upcoming week, is the thing that I've been telling them is you look at what's happened for the past 20 years, and you've seen how the Pacific has been cooler more than it's been warm. And during those cooler than average phases, we've struggled. All right. So I was doing some work for a producer that was looking at some property in southeast New Mexico. And I went back for 13 years. And at this particular spot, 70% of the time, that spot out of those 13 years has had severe drought to deal with at any one particular time of the year. Now, that to me, I'm telling him, I'm like, why do you want to do that to yourself? Okay. Unless you're just embracing the land of enchantment and want to live in Southeast New Mexico and are not trying to make a profit off of it. Or here's a caveat to this, as I always tell people, if you want to make money in a drought and you want to go buy a big ranch and you want to put it all into pasture, rangeland, and forage insurance, go ahead, roll the dice. There are ways to make significant money during dry times. And that's a whole other conversation. And I do a lot of work for people with that. But as I've told my folks for the next several years, and I've told them point blank, I'm like, you know, you guys are 70 years old. You know, what the hell are you guys doing running cattle in dry land? You know, it's been rough. There's no way around it. They've been through several culls. They've been having to do this, buy it back. What are we going to do? No, I've told them, I'm like, you know, this is the norm when you farm and ranch in the Western High Plains. A lot of folks got started in agriculture in the Western High Plains in the 90s. Boy, what a shock that was. 90s were the wettest decade on record up in my country. They were very wet across the southwestern United States. And that is an extreme aberration to where we are right now. You flip the script with the Pacific going cold, you have a whole other set of things to deal with. So going forward, do I think that there will be more dry times than wet times going forward? Yeah, I do. And that doesn't necessarily say individual wet years you can make money on. But when you're looking at things as a whole, I've got some folks up here in Southeast Colorado that say, you know what, Brian, we've been in drought since 98. Now, I know farmers and ranchers exaggerate, all right? And you never get as much moisture as your neighbor does down the road, which always seems to be weird because then you're getting more moisture than they are, but you're not getting, you see what I mean? So I think you have to paint it out for them to just simply say, look, the days of not knowing when drought is coming are over. The days of not being able to plan for drought are over. And if you want to be a rancher in dry country, you need to know when those dry times are coming so you can plan accordingly. Even if those dry times are going to be more frequent than the wetter times, you can still make money doing that kind of thing. So in terms of 2022 and what we're looking at here, we're going to have to see how the oceans are stacked. To be perfectly honest with you, I don't have any idea. I just don't. Right now, we're entering into a period of time that we affectionately called the spring unpredictability season when it comes to long-range models. Longer range models, when we get into March, April, and May, struggle because of the seasonal change that's going on. So when we get into summer, we have a better idea about how the oceans are going to be stacked for the following year. So I would check back then. I would hit me up with an email and whatnot then if you're interested in that kind of thing, and we can talk about that. You know, but you know what? This isn't news to anybody. Okay, I know we talk about this stuff all the time, but the problem is that we many times think that there's going to be a different answer to this. If you farm and ranch in the desert, you are going to be drier more than you are going to be wetter, and that's just common sense. End of story. Anybody else want to hear some depressing news?
All right. Well, thank you again, Brian. And I think with that, if there are some more questions, we may have some time after the next speaker as well. But Brian, I think we, in the interest of time, better move on a little bit. And we really appreciate, though the message is harsh, we appreciate your time coming out for sure.
Well, I appreciate you guys having me, and I'll preface this by saying, you know what, this is all the future. It could easily be wrong, and I hope it is. But when you're making a long range forecast and you're looking at the evidence, you're doing forensics, it doesn't look too nice, at least over the next few months. So we'll see where we sit during the back half of that summer. Hopefully we get some rain here.
Thanks again, Brian.
Thank you guys for having me. It's always a pleasure.
All right, and before we jump into the next speaker, I just want to mention some of the sponsors. Normally, we have a really good trade show and an excellent set of sponsors. This year, we also have good sponsors. Unfortunately, don't have the trade show to go with it, but of course, we have our gold sponsors with the New Mexico Cattle Growers and Allflex. And then coming up with the platinum sponsor, our Nutrition Plus, of course. And I think we have another, the Sustainable Crop Insurance Service Program. So we really appreciate our sponsors for this year, especially under the trying times and the different formats. So thank you. We really appreciate that. Coming up next, we have Dr. David Anderson, who's a professor at Texas A&M AgriLife Extension, and he's a he's an extension economist, for livestock and food product marketing in the Department of Agriculture Economics at Texas A&M. His work involves the analysis of livestock market economics and policy. He has authored or co-authored more than 800 journal articles, extension publications, symposiums, presented papers, popular press, and other articles, as well as teaches a graduate course on agriculture policy. He is originally from Coolidge, Arizona, where his father is a cotton farmer. So he's well versed also in the dry farming down here in the desert, and safe to say an excellent economist. So thank you, Dr. Anderson, for coming out. We really appreciate it.
Hey, thanks for inviting me. I appreciate the chance to be with y'all tonight. It's always be better in person, but I'm glad to be with you anyway. Let me see if I can share this screen okay. Let's see here. Share. Craig, you see that okay?
Yes, it looks great, Dr. Anderson.
Fantastic. So anyway, thanks again for inviting me. I sure appreciate the chance to be with y'all tonight. I don't know what's worth going before the weatherman or after the weatherman, because we'll figure out which one of us is a better or worse predictor, the economist or the weatherman. So this is quite a deal tonight that you put two of us like this that deal with, for good or bad, projections right here together. So when Bruce approached me, we wanted to talk about the cattle market some. We also want to talk about based on the cattle market, based on some longer term projections of prices, when we get the chance to rebuild, is it going to be as awful as it was with prices in about 2014 following the drought that we had in Texas in 2011 and 12? And so I'm going to build this together with sort of a cattle market outlook, and then use that to talk about where that goes for rebuilding the herd costs and replacement costs down the road. And so with that, let's if I can hey, it's working good. I got three most important factors I want to hit, and then of course I put 4 bullets on here, which I couldn't count, I guess. But really 3 things I really want to hit in terms of the cattle market, and then use that to go into kind of rebuilding costs. And of course, I'm going to build on what the lead into this was all our longer term weather forecasts, some feed costs. And so let's jump right in. And I'll say right up front, I'll tell you in terms of the cattle market, I think there are some reasons in here for some real optimism in terms of where we're headed over the next couple of years in prices. And I'll also show you my projections of cattle prices and calf prices through 2022, kind of build on this idea of a fundamental market outlook. And so I'll show you what my forecasts are. So let me start out with drought and feed costs. And I'm going to use the kind of shorter term drought monitor as opposed to the longer term one. In that little intro, I appreciate you guys doing that, but I'm actually from a town that's in this dark red. I don't know if you can see my cursor here or not, but I'm on the south side of the Gila River. In the town is Coolidge, Arizona is where I'm from, but it's in that area that's in the dark red in Arizona. I think as we start looking at the calf market and we talk about prices, this is one of the more important things going on, is simply where we set up for drought. And I'm going to come back to this same slide when we talk about rebuilding, but that path of drought, that path of as this develops, I think that's an important one for where we go in the market this year. a further, exacerbation of the drought, growing this area as we grow. If this grows into more, to encompass more of Texas, as some of those longer term forecasts would suggest, more of Oklahoma, and as it gets worse in the northern plains region of the U.S., that's when I think we'll really start talking about some bigger and bigger cattle market impacts, both short term and long term of drought. I want to show two charts of feed costs, because I think that's the other big thing right now really hitting us in terms of calf prices in the cattle market, is really where we're going in terms of feed costs. And so I'm going to show this using Southern Plains corn prices, dollars per bushel. I'm going to use this same kind of convention throughout my slides, with the solid red line is a 5-year average, the dotted line is last year, and the blue line is so far this year. And really, I want to highlight this change in prices relative to a year ago, and relative to that 5-year average. We're close to pushing $6 a bushel. If we think about Southern Plains, and then we got to add some more to that to get it to a feedlot. But that's certainly quite a bit more than where we've been over the last several years. And so one of the big things pressing down on calf prices, or keeping calf prices from growing and increasing more than they have been so far this year, is really where we are in terms of feed costs. They move opposite to each other. The higher feed costs are, when they go up, calf prices tend to go down, and vice versa. And so we're really, I think, set up into something here where this is the big negative, I think, for calf prices this year, is this: where do corn prices go? I would point out a couple things about this as well. And one thing to always remember is, so one, why are prices doing this? Tight supplies out of South America which are big competitors, but also really booming export demand coming from China, where we're shipping a lot of crop there that we have. And so it's driving the price higher. I think the thing to remember is high prices are a market signal to something, and that is to make more of it. And so one of the things I would expect to see because of these high prices, certainly large numbers of acres planted this year, and then will be depending on just plain how the crop develops. I think USDA's first projection of corn planted acres was about 92 million acres that came out last week at their Outlook conference, but certainly more acres than the year before planted. And we'll see how it develops, but certainly this is pressing down, kind of dragging on our calf prices. And I thought I would also show soybean meal. If I think about corn and soybean meal, kind of an energy and protein feed complex, both of those ingredients are certainly well above where we were a year ago. And so in terms of thinking about feedlot cost of gains, things like that, really, who's buying our calves eventually are feeders. And so the higher feed costs are, the lower our calf prices are. And so both of those, the drought and feed costs are really working against us in terms of the cattle market so far this year. And then we're gonna see where that goes later in the year. But certainly, if I took a 92, 94 million acres of corn, some trend yields, that's a very large crop, and probably speaks to some lower prices and some help to calf prices this fall, simply because larger supplies and some lower prices of feed. I think the second big bullet I wanted to talk about a cattle inventory, and not only a short-term inventory, where are we in terms of cattle on feed and beef production, but also some longer-term, more cyclical cattle cycle type things as to where we are. And I'm going to start with this longer-term idea. And with that, I'm going to use USDA's cattle inventory report that came out at the end of January. If we look here on the far right, January 1, 2021, we had 31.2 million head of beef cows in the U.S., down 0.6%. We were down about 1.3% last year. So in terms of a cattle cycle, we've hit the peak and we're coming back down. So we're a couple of years into this liquidation phase of the cow herd, and really driven more importantly by one thing, and that's lower prices. We remember, we have a cattle cycle in terms of numbers, but we have an opposite cycle in terms of price. And so following our big drought in 2011 and 12, cattle prices went to record highs. We've expanded our herds, and now that expansion has come to a close as prices declined. We start cutting the herd a little bit, and that's exactly where we're going. And I'm going to come back to this same chart at the end when we talk about longer term rebuilding. I want to draw some implications from this as well. And so I'll hold off on that, but I think that gives a good picture of where we are in the cycle. I would also argue that this is a relatively slow decline based on prices and things like that, pushing us to lower numbers. It's a relatively slow decline. And to get a rapid decline, I think depends a lot on that path of drought evolution. In terms of cow slaughter, we moved a lot of cows, and certainly in drought-stricken areas of the West, we moved more cows. We culled more. We moved more cows to slaughter. So far this year, our slaughter is above where it was a year ago. Last year's pace of beef cow culling really led us to a smaller cow herd. And so, I think that's worth just pointing out where we are now in terms of those numbers. We're continuing to move a pretty large number of cows to market so far early this year. Some more short-term supplies. I'm going to show a couple of feedlot charts in terms of feedlot placements. It's easy to go back and think and take a look at last year, where we were, March and April. Coronavirus hits, all of the effects ripple through our markets. We certainly placed fewer cattle. That rapidly changed through May through September. We placed more than we did the year before. We sort of dropped off a little bit, and here we are now in the report that just came out Friday had placements just a little larger, about 3% larger than they were a year ago. So we're placing those animals, and we're right on the edge of cyclically having those larger supplies before they really tail off later this year to less and less calves available, feeder cattle available to go on feed, and less beef production as well. We look at cattle on feed. Cattle on feed continues to be just over a year ago. And so I can see that I forgot to update these two. So I forgot to put the blue line up to get my February number in there. But we continue to see cattle on feed just over 1% higher than a year ago. So we've got some more supplies. So short term, in terms of supplies of beef on the marketplace, I'm going to argue we're going to be looking at larger beef supplies compared to a year ago over the next several months. I would suggest and continue to think that as we get towards later in the year, we're going to see beef production begin to decline, begin to be smaller than it was last year. And so the effect of that on our cattle market is tighter supplies and higher prices. So what we saw in feed costs pushing our calf prices lower, overall supply numbers are going to start pushing those prices higher and working against that. So we got some positive factors as well. I put this chart in this afternoon because I really wanted to show something I think is interesting. Look at this decline in just last week, the last couple of weeks. But if you take a look at this sharp decline in total cattle numbers going to market, that's the storm last week. So the storm that closed, that had certainly packing plant delays, the inability to move cattle to those plants, even though they're open. Sometimes you can't get cattle moved there. You can't get a lot of movements around to packing plants. And so we certainly see this pretty sharp decline in cattle slaughter that's just driven by the weather. I think when this week's slaughter number comes out from USDA at the end of the week, we're going to see that thing bounce back to pushing back up to where it was as we sort of recover from the storm. So I think it's kind of interesting when we see events like that. It shows up in the data and kind of gives us some context of what we see. And I thought that was a good example just to show a little bit. I thought it kind of puts it in some context. Of course, certainly you can see the decline in April and May with all the coronavirus related issues, but then certainly cattle slaughter rebounded after that and was actually ahead of where we were the year before. If we look at the steers, you don't see that big decline in the data. That's because there's a little bit of a lag in the data. So we don't have that share of last week's slaughter that was steers versus total cattle. So as the data comes out, you'll see that big decline and then you'll see it rebound. So, you know, I certainly mentioned that cattle on feed is ahead of where we were a year ago. So is steer slaughter. We're moving those animals through the process. They're becoming beef production, and you know, certainly we've changed or lost some of that log jam we talked about a heck of a lot of the time in 2020. We're sort of moving along in terms of numbers. Weights, again, there's a lag in this data. One of the things I'm interested in seeing just from a data standpoint is when we get the data for last week's storm, and then the effects of that on weights over the last number of weeks. One of the things we certainly might expect to see is a decline in these steer dressed weights, which is going to pull down beef production a little bit more. So, you know, it's moving dressed weights closer to where they were last year when we started out with some pretty healthy weights going on, contributing to larger beef production. I think the effects of this storm are going to be such to really kind of drag down those weights in coming weeks. And so that's something I'm looking forward to seeing in the data as well, to really kind of track effects on beef production. And I put in beef production, you'll notice that big decline. There's also no lag in beef production data. So this is actually last week's data from the storm. And so you really get a pretty sharp looking view of what the storm means for beef production. Again, I expect that to see some rebound mitigated by some weight changes as going forward. But, you know, last year, even with this April and May time period, we produced more beef than we did the year before. So we put a lot of beef on our market, even with all the turmoil in terms of restaurants versus grocery stores and all of that turmoil. We were moving more beef than we were the year before. And that's really an accomplishment. While this is a supply number, I think it speaks to some demand issues. And that one is that fundamentally, I would argue that we have a pretty healthy, strong demand for beef in the marketplace. I think that's another one of those factors that's going to keep the pressure on building our calf prices later in the year as supplies tighten, yet that demand is there. I think that certainly argues for some better prices over the next couple of years. I broke it up into quarters because I wanted to highlight a couple of things. So I've got my beef production projection out through 2022. That's the brown bars. This lighter blue is 21. The dark blue is 2020, and the red bar is a 5-year average. And what I would point out is, you know, look at this dark blue in 2020 in the second quarter, April, May, and June, really in the heart of the coronavirus effects on our packing plants. We're going to produce more beef this year than we did last year in that quarter. And that's really just the statistics of the effects of coronavirus in our market. But if you look at after that, every quarter, third quarter, fourth quarter of 21, and every quarter of 22, we're going to be talking about and looking and having less beef on our market. So our supplies are starting to reflect that declining cycle of beef cow numbers. And so declining beef production, and I think that's going to be something that is pretty supportive of cattle prices going forward. I checked my watch for the time. I think you guys can see me looking down just to make sure I'm sort of on time, doing okay. Let me kind of talk a touch about prices and trade. I'm going to show a couple of price charts and then a couple of trade things, just, you know, for completeness in a market. When we talk about the market, I always get some trade questions, and I think there's a couple of good points there in terms of trade that I think we'll talk about affecting our market later this year, particularly. So 500 to 600 pound number one steers in the Southern Plains. When I talk about the effects of feed costs on calf prices, So far, we're running basically below a year ago. And quite honestly, I think most all of that effect is due to higher feed costs. The cost of feed rations is forcing those bids lower for calves. And, I think that's going to continue to be a running story throughout the year as we deal with high feed costs as well. And so that path of getting acres planted, getting a crop off to a good start. Of course, there'll be weather concerns in the corn market, but a good yield and large productions are going to be pretty critical, particularly for fall calf prices. But we're certainly starting off pressured by those. We see the exact same thing on feeder cattle. 750-pound number one steers headed to a feed yard somewhere have certainly been pressured by feed costs in the Southern Plains as well. And I think that shows up perfectly in the data. Exactly what we ought to expect is what we're seeing, some pressure on prices because of feed costs. In the fed cattle market, we've also been running below where we were a year ago. And I guess this being the last week of February, we're about 2 weeks away from the kind of the anniversary of really starting to see shutdowns due to coronavirus and the volatility in fed cattle prices, particularly throughout the spring into early summer and midsummer. But we're starting out the year below a year ago, and we really have two headwinds working against us here. One is beef production greater than a year ago. And I think the second thing is we continue to struggle with the restaurant segment of beef consumption. And so that continues, I think, to drag down prices as we continue to see. We haven't recovered that whole shift from restaurants to grocery stores. We don't have that restaurant segment back to the health it was a year ago. And I was thinking about a year ago on March the 10th, I did a cattle market program for a bunch of stocker cattle producers in Central Texas. And it happened to be, I was looking at my phone about 30 minutes before I was supposed to talk. And that's when all the announcements hit the news that all the casinos in Las Vegas had closed their buffets. And so it was really sort of the first big shot of this. And so that's sort of been on my mind lately as we think, because I think that's a great highlight of that restaurant segment, hotel, restaurant, institutional trade segment of beef consumption, as opposed to just grocery stores. And so, I think that's really where we're dragging our fed cattle prices lower, is ample supplies right now. And we don't quite have that consumption back because of restaurants. A little bit about exports. Everything that's hit us from coronavirus ripples all the way through the market, from retail back to all, the ranch side, and then it goes all the way back through. And look at this decline in exports right in May and June as our prices at wholesale skyrocketed. We had very tight supplies because packing plants were closed. It was tough to be competitive in world markets, and we didn't export very much compared to the year before or even the average. What I think is important to look at this rebound in exports. December was a huge number, almost 290 million pounds. In fact, we exported by volume about 75 million pounds more than we imported. So we went back to being a net exporter, where we're exporting more than we're importing. So where I think that's important is going forward this year, as supplies tighten, as we continue to have really a booming export market, that's another segment of beef demand that's growing. And so I think this export picture that we're looking at really argues for some continued, really robust, really strong beef demand supporting prices. And anytime with that we're selling more than we're bringing in, it really helps our overall supply situation to get to higher prices. So I think to me, that's an important quick look at something in the trade side that I think helps us. I want to show you one other trade thing, because I think this is interesting, and it's something we rarely ever talk about, but I think I'm hoping y'all might find it interesting too. But this chart is cattle exports to Mexico. And if you look at that growth over the last 6 months, the amount of cattle that we're seeing in Mexico has grown pretty sharply. What's interesting is that growth is almost all in fed cattle, slaughter cattle going to Mexico, particularly from South Texas feedlots. That we have feeders there who are getting competitive bids for fed cattle to go that way rather than to go north. And that's really, I think, a change in kind of how our market works, and really, with trade, a North American market, but we're really starting to see with growth in packing plants and some feeding capacity in Mexico, but particularly packing capacity, where we see competitive bids drawing fed cattle that way. And I think that's really an interesting change in our market. We rarely would have talked about that, although we've always exported breeding stock to Mexico, to ranches in Mexico. Now we've got some more fed cattle moving that way. And so I think overall, I think of this as a real positive for particularly South Texas feeders, particularly those, if you're feeding some cattle that have more ear, got more Brahma in them, we've got an active market there to move some fed cattle that way. And that's actually, I think, a pretty positive for ranchers and feeders in South Texas, that this has opened up. That's kind of a relatively new change. I think it's kind of interesting and just something to see. So, I throw that out for your interest, and hopefully that, sparks some interest. I find it kind of an interesting change. I think it's going to be interesting to see how it progresses, particularly as our cattle numbers change. Let me say a little bit about economic recovery as it relates to beef demand. And I'm going to do this in two really macroeconomic charts. And one is gross domestic product by quarter. So the quarter over quarter change. And what I want to highlight is, look at the last 4 quarters. This red line, it's about a 9% reduction in gross domestic product, all driven by coronavirus shutdowns in our economy. If we put that on an annualized basis, that's like a 36% roughly contraction of our economy jammed into a quarter. So a 9% reduction in our gross domestic product. Really, our size of our economy and our ability, our incomes to go buy stuff. And look at the rebound in the 3rd quarter. We got to almost 8%. So we got a bunch of that back, not all of it. And I think that particularly represents the lingering effects in our segment of our economy that deals with restaurants and, stuff like movie theaters, travel, entertainment, things like that are still being hit by this. Yet we got the next quarter's data, and it's positive again, really on par with what we'd seen for a number of years before that. So I think what we're really talking about here is an economy that's coming out of the effects of coronavirus, that's starting to restart. The more people we get vaccinated, the more, quite honestly, the more people that got it and have some immunity, but the more people we can get vaccinated to restart things, really, I think, speaks positively about our opportunity for economic growth and, quite honestly, for beef demand. We know a growing economy and people with more money in their pockets helps beef. And so, and certainly some of the restaurants that have been closed are those that oftentimes are higher end places selling higher end beef products. And so that restarting, I think, really bodes well for the opportunity for growing beef demand over the coming year, over the coming 2 years. And so I thought I'd just kind of use this instead of, per capita beef consumption and some things like that, because I think this really shows some potential for growth. I want to show you one other chart that, we probably rarely use. It's not something you would see very often, but in terms of macroeconomic data, this is what's called personal savings as a percent of disposable personal income. So if we dug into macroeconomic data on incomes, average incomes, per capita incomes, how much money do we save of the money we have to spend? And this is on a percent. So over here on my y-axis is percents. I've got years here on the y-axis, on the other. the other axis. I get all tongue twisted. But one of the things I think is interesting is we might talk about this long-term upward slope in more savings really since the Great Recession in 2008 and 9. But look at this spike. So per capita or personal savings, we actually got over 25% of folks' income was saved in that second quarter of last year. Well, why'd they do that? Well, heck, they couldn't go out anywhere. Restaurants were closed, entertainment, no travel. People ended up sitting at home, and they ended up saving a heck of a lot of money. And I think one of the other things that's interesting in this, that taken as a whole across our whole country, over 25% of this personal income was saved. Excuse me. That includes a whole ton of people who lost their jobs and were faced with ruin as the economy contracted. Those who were fortunate enough, blessed enough to have a job, to still have money coming in, didn't do anything with it and ended up sitting at home saving it. What you're seeing here in the next 2 quarters, this decline, is folks starting to be able to go out and spend money again. So one of the interesting statistics I think about the economy is that roughly 70% of our economy is all of us spending money, buying stuff. And what happens if, we tend to think saving money is a good thing. Well, in the overall economy, if you save too much, the economy doesn't grow. And so as folks start to open up their wallets and spend money, I think the potential for this to jumpstart our economy over the coming year or so, I think is a huge number in terms of our ability to get going again. And excuse me, I think that relates to growing beef demand. And so what I would argue is much of beef demand, which I think currently is actually quite good, actually may grow and be even better as our economy grows. And so you might think that some of our beef demand situation depends on the path of economic recovery. And that's one of the things I'd hope to leave you with, is that idea that the path of our recovery matters for beef demand. And so, I want to throw that out too. That is probably a chart most of us would probably never even look at, but I think it's something really interesting as we see, well, what does it mean? Well, people couldn't spend their money, so they left it in their pocket. And now they're starting to spend it again. So let me say a couple of keys for the calf market to summarize all that mess. I think drought, obviously a key. Feed costs. I think economic recovery in the broader beef market is a really important factor. And of course, our cyclical cattle numbers were leading to tighter supplies and higher prices. So a couple of these argue for higher prices. A couple of them drag prices down. And so with that, let me show you my price outlook through 2022. And I've got this put together by quarters of the year, first, second, third, and fourth quarter of each year. 2019 up here at this top row is an annual average, just for context, 500 to 600 pound steers, 700 to 800 pound steers. Fed cattle is that column next to the years. And I would point out a couple of things. One is I basically expect calf prices this fall to be higher than they were in 20, and 2022 to be higher than they were in 21. So I basically expect in my projections here, moderating feed costs, a growing economy, tighter cattle and beef supplies, and higher prices because of it. Whether we're talking, 550 pound steers, feeder cattle, or fed cattle, I think the long-term outlook for the cattle market, I think, is a positive one. And I think there's a lot of reasons for some optimism going forward that we're headed to higher prices. So there's that thing for you to look at. And I'm going to move on to a couple other slides, but we can sure come back to that one. And any of y'all, if you want my slides, just say the word, we'll get them to you. So if I put all this together, what does rebuilding look like? Or does it look like 2014 with these record high replacement values? Excuse me, let me get a drink. I want to go back to the drought monitor. I think one of the things for it to look like 2014, we would have to see this drought expand further east, particularly this Texas and Oklahoma area that is not on the colored in parts of the map, and for it to get worse in the northern plains. I'm going to argue that that's where we would have to see drought really expand to really force a lot more cow culling to make it look like 2014. I say that because if we go to the inventory map, this decline in cattle numbers here really reflects the effect of the 2011 and 2012 drought in Texas. We cut more than 1 million beef cows in those 2 years. More than 20% of the state's herd went to market. And so that alone was more than 1 million beef cows. That's what drug us down from basically a little over 30 million to 28.9 million beef cows in the US at that time. And that's what drove prices to those astronomical levels. Where we are now, I would argue, is really a slow cyclical decline. And I would argue with rising calf prices, moderating feed costs, and the path of tighter supplies we're on, we could actually argue for some growing cow herd by 2023 even. And so I think to see cow numbers get down to this level to trigger those kinds of replacement costs, I think that requires something drastic to happen to force numbers lower. And so that path of drought is another big factor really in where we go. And so, I'm going to kind of waffle around a little bit here and say it really depends on that path of drought and how that thing grows or not over the coming year, because that's what forces our numbers low enough to get below some of these thresholds to get beef production to a level that forces prices like that. So what I'm going to argue is that basically it's not going to be like 2014, but it depends on the path of the drought. The cow inventory is in a slow decline. We're headed for some higher prices, economic recovery, good beef demand, all that stuff I talked about, I think argues for higher prices, the interest in rebuilding and higher replacement costs, but not what we saw in 14 and 15. But I want to bring out a couple of ideas based on, when Bruce and I were talking earlier about this, is it going to look like 2014 and how do we restock? Folks, last time, gosh, we were forced to get rid of the cows. The drought forced us to get rid of the cows. And so one of the things I've been thinking about is, can we think about some other ways to maybe prepare? And so I'm going to throw out an idea that we might think of is nuts. And I think it's sort of crisis times that force us to maybe think about creatively about some other ideas. And one of the things that I had been thinking about a little bit and putting a pencil to with some ideas is, could we take our heifers that we wanted to keep and send them somewhere else to be raised? The old rule of thumb is you can't feed your way out of a drought. Because in the drought, feed becomes much more expensive and it's so hard to get that, you just can't keep, because pretty soon, you've spent all the money you would have, you had. So, the idea that you can't feed your way out of a drought, I think is an important one. Yet, can we think of some other ideas like something like sending heifers away? Let's say we got some replacement heifers. Can we send them somewhere else to be raised? We might talk about some ideas like that, somebody with a backgrounder yard, a dry lot somewhere. Can we pay them to do that? Now, that happens all the time in the dairy industry, where the heifers are sent to a calf raising place. They're going to raise those heifers and you're going to get them back on the dairy 2 years old and ready to have a calf. And so, can we take an idea like that and would that work for us? Maybe sending some heifers away for a year and then they come back to have their calf. Those who've already been on the ranch for a while. I think there's some advantages. If you've got a herd that you think really fits the country you're in, desert, dry land, that you've got cows that excel and you don't want to lose that, this might be a way to hang on to them. And I think you could get those, taking that idea from the dairy side, they come back to us ready to have a calf. There's some disadvantages for sure. One is, I'm going to pay for feed every day because I'm going to pay them a monthly feed bill and them caring, somebody caring for the animals, getting them bred, and I'm going to get them back. But is that a cheaper alternative to buying them 2 years down the road when we're out of the drought and we're trying to expand as cattle prices are going up? And so I think it's worth thinking through that balance a little bit. It's also a disadvantage because we're going to be spending money on that feed bill when our revenue's down. But we might also get another little benefit from maybe not having those animals out eating the grass that we can conserve what we have for the cows. So, I think there's some advantages and disadvantages to think about beyond just the dollars and cents money here. But I like to start thinking creative about this. I think there's a couple of things that happen in this as well. I think you get a bunch of flexibility. If drought gets worse, replacement prices skyrocket. You've got yours cheaper than you could buy them on the open market. Or you could say heck with it and just sell them to somebody else if they want to pay that much for them. If replacements don't increase sharply, but go up drastically along with cattle prices, you've already bought them, you've developed them, and you're ahead of the game. In terms of AIing those heifers, you're going to be picking the genetics that your next generation is going to have. And I think there's some advantages in that as well. And so, I think there's a bunch of advantages and disadvantages here. But you know what, if we thought about that for a second, let's say, I'm going to throw out a number. Let's say it costs you $2 a day in feed and development. Over a year, we got $730 in that replacement. That's how much we've got in her. Plus, you ought to think about it in accounting sense and in economic sense and pay yourself for her as a calf to begin with. So you might think, well, then after a year, I got $1,400 in her. If they didn't come back for 2 years, and we want them to calve it too, let's say, I got $1,400 in there in feed in them, but we bring them back when we have the grass to carry them. Now, I know that there were people that tried things like this, not only dry lotting the cows in the last drought that we had, doing some strategies like that, sending the animals to greener pastures, not culling them, but sending them somewhere where they had grass until the drought was over. But I think there's a bunch of strategies we could think about doing here. And we think about, something we might have $1,500, let's say, in this new heifer when she has her first calf doing this strategy versus what it might cost us for that animal out on the marketplace might be significantly more. I think there's some cash flow ideas here. I think you certainly got to have a plan with a banker to pull something off like this. But, I think it's drought times like this that should force us to really think creatively about, can we do some things maybe different, even though we know in our mind, we know we can't really feed our way out of a drought by buying hay. I think we could do some things that might make us be able to get back in faster. So that's some, kind of thinking of things that we're putting some numbers to. And I've yacked on long enough. Let me show you one other thing, and that's really my contact information, my email, my phone number's down there at the bottom. Quite honestly, in all this mess, email is the best way to catch me, and it's pretty simple. danderson@tamu.edu. I love getting questions from folks, and I'd love to get them. Great big thank you is really my last slide. Thank you again for having me. I appreciate the chance to be here. I'm going to stop sharing and we'll take some questions. Did that stop sharing, Craig?
Yes, it did. And Jason and Marcy, if you guys could MC the question section.
David, I think this may have been somewhere in the vicinity of about halfway through. You showed 2 slides back to back. One was on beef production and the other was commercial beef production. Yeah. There were a couple questions on those and specifically whether or not those numbers include imports or that's only domestically produced beef.
So great question. And it's true. The first one was federally inspected, And the other one was commercial, which includes non-federally inspected. And FI, federally inspected slaughter, is the vast majority, like 96% or something like that of commercial slaughter. Beef production includes, so it's going to include cattle that we import from Canada and Mexico that go to a US packing plant. So it becomes part of commercial or federally inspected beef production in the US because they went to a US plant. It would include calves that came from Mexico, went to a ranch, then went to a feedlot, then went to a US packing plant. It does not include imports. It would include the amount we're gonna export because it got produced in a US plant and then gets sold. So I think that's a great question in terms of supplies. It does include animals that come here that go through a US plant, but not imported beef. Great question.
And not long after that, we received a question that I think you addressed indirectly, but really about Mexico and Latin and South America. Are they seeing some of the same drought issues that we're currently seeing? And if so, is that affecting their productivity from a beef production standpoint?
So that has certainly affected their crop production, corn and soybean production. In some of those, particularly thinking about Brazil and Argentina, quite honestly, I haven't looked at some of those drought areas to look at how the drought areas match where their cattle production is. But that's been some of their problems on the crop side, which is why we're exporting so much more, which is why our price is going up. I mean, that's an excellent question. In terms of Mexico, like when you look at the drought monitor, the drought conditions don't end at the river. They go on down below. And so, I mean, I think that's a great question as well. And certainly, we've certainly seen severe drought in Mexico drive more calves coming to the US in the past. That sometimes that's part of increased imports of feeder cattle and calves from Mexico is because they're out of grass too. And so, that certainly has in the past driven those numbers as well. Great question.
Getting quite a few comments coming in. Thanking you, Dr. Anderson, and requesting slides. And I think I saw a chat just a little bit ago that the plan is to send those slides out. Yeah, Sonia had mentioned that the plan is to gather all those slides and they'll be emailed out to all the participants. That's correct, Marcy, isn't it?
Yeah, and so we're recording tonight's program that will be hosted on, and I'll put it here really quickly, our link to our website. It's the same website where you registered for the program, and you'll find recordings of tonight. I have a question, Dr. Anderson. So I shouldn't smile because it's kind of unfortunate, but the cattle in New Mexico or the cows in particular are leaving in droves. They're going to slaughter. They're not going in to other herds. And based on Brian's presentation, this looks like this is going to be a long-term pattern of causing further herd reductions and in the cow belt, not just New Mexico. And so my question is, what are your thoughts? I know you gave a couple different scenarios with where the cow market or heifer replacement market's going to go, but what are your thoughts on cow inventories in the next 12 months? And then are we going to see what we saw in 2015 with heifer prices being sort of
outrageous
to the point where you could never pay for her, right? So
what I would argue is that, I think the cow herd a year from now is going to be smaller than it is this year. When I say that, the whole US, our whole US herd, I think we're going to be smaller. How much smaller? Really, I think just depends on drought severity and does it expand even more? And so, we could be down, another 0.5% a year from now. but we could be down quite a bit more if that area that's in the dark red on those maps, if that grows to include Texas and Oklahoma as it did in 11 and 12, or Montana, North and South Dakota, forcing even more culling on the market, that's when we would see even larger changes. So a half a percent. I don't think that's enough to drive replacement prices to $2,500, $3,000, $3,500 like we saw in 14 and 15 that were really so high. You know what? If you were the first one that bought those and had an extra 2 years of productivity out of them, you might have made it. But if you bought them at the end, and it'd be hard to get them paid for. And so that's where I kind of think this idea of, can we dry lot some of them? Can we get some, can we get a backgrounder to feed them and do some, not feedlot ration? And I'm going to defer to you guys. I'm an economist that sits and writes on numbers, but Marcy, you and Bruce and Jason, you guys thinking about that from an animal standpoint, could we do some creative things like that to develop those replacements and do it a bunch cheaper than we would buy them for later in that scenario of very high prices? Because I think if we went back and looked at 13, 14, 15, we could have done a strategy like that and had half as much money in them. And so it seems to me that there are ways we could do that with some probably relatively cheap rations that would develop those animals and bring them back to the ranch already bred and ready to go. And boy, it sure seems like to me this is the time to be trying to think creatively now. And I'll let you guys tell me I'm nuts, because I'm just typing in numbers and economizing here. So you guys tell me from the other side of it whether something like that would work. But boy, it seems like an idea we ought to at least think through.
I think there's a lot of value in at least evaluating those options. Speaking from the cattle feeding standpoint right now, I think for that to work in most places in our region, we're going to have to be willing to put wheels under them. It is just unbelievably expensive to feed cattle right now. I mean, the numbers you showed, Southern Plains corn, spot on, because we're buying some right now. I think you use soybean meal to show this, but that's not just a corn thing. That's everything. Everything's expensive if you can get it. That's the other part of the equation, is for some ingredients that we would typically use as our more economical source of nutrients, just don't have access to them right now.
I tend to use soybean meal because it's the 600-pound gorilla in the room in terms of the protein feed complex, and that drives everything else. Yep. And so all your other protein feeds are driven by that thing. And so that's why I use that, even though that's not what we'd use in a ration. The other thing I would say, I think you make a good point. If I didn't make this clearly, I think you gotta move those cows to somewhere where the feed is, not feed them on the ranch in my thinking of this example, but send them somewhere and then bring them back.
I agree. I'd like to hear everyone else's thoughts on it.
Well, yeah, and maybe your panel tomorrow night, they can shoot holes in me, and I accept that freely. So
kind of asked some of them to be on the panel for that. I know some of them had tried some of that. I don't want to speak for them, but maybe some other people looking back. I think labor was a big problem once they got where they were going, especially if they were on pasture.
Yes.
And sometimes things were not as they were agreed upon when the cattle arrived versus when they left.
Boy, I think you got to have somebody you trust, somebody with a good reputation, and have a relationship developed with whoever's going to do that. It just seems to me that's pretty critical. It does seem to me they seem to make that work on the dairy side. And so maybe we might learn something. I don't, heaven forbid, right?
Well,
I think, you know, with females, you're looking at more forage intake than grain per se, but even that's getting really cost prohibitive in some scenarios. And then finding the availability in terms of dry lots that will take cows in or females in to feed them so they don't get too fat. I mean, it's a challenge for sure, but I think that is a good approach versus having to buy in at exceedingly high prices on your young females, versus investing in the feed side of your own females. So appreciate that.
So there is another question that came in, Dr. Anderson. I'm just going to read it directly from the chat. So with the lower cattle on feed inventory, do you think that we're going to get short sheeted with an increase in beef imports? And if so, how much would you expect that would hamper some of the price projections moving forward?
So one of the interesting thing about imports is about 70% of what we import is lean beef trimmings that we put into ground beef. And so what that competes most with is our cull cow market. And so one of the things that happens is the more cows we cull, the more lean beef trimmings we have, and it drives that price down, which makes our market less attractive to imports. And so we can actually have a situation where, because we cull a bunch of cows, our imports can go down because we have all the trimmings we need. And so the interaction with the fed cattle side becomes a lot of the fat to mix with the lean to get the mix we want for ground beef. And so there's a lot of interactions there, but you know, overall, I don't think that it's necessarily the case that will be to the point with declining cattle on feed inventories and beef production that sharply drives our imports up. You know, we are exporting more than we're importing right now. We have tended over the last few years that even on an annual basis, we've exported more than we've imported. And so, you know, I don't think it's not really quite as bad as we might think right off the top of our head, mainly because of the mix of beef that is traded. And so I think I would probably argue that that's not going to hamper my cattle price and calf price projections. Good question.
All right. Well, thank you. I greatly appreciate the information, Dr. Anderson.
Hey, there's one more
Okay.
about the my cattle price projections. I basically do those for what used to be called as a series of data called the Texas Combined Auction Series. And it is more of a Central West North Texas kind of price. Typically in all of our calf markets, the farther south we go, the farther east we go, and the farther west we go, we do get lower prices, but it's largely a function of transportation to the panhandle. And so for a lot of New Mexico, the price difference to that would not be much difference compared to, say, San Angelo, Texas, for instance, or something, because, you know, we're going from different directions, but to the same point. And so, you know, I wouldn't, you know, that's sort of what that price basis is. It would be, you know, Oklahoma City's prices would be higher than what I'm showing there for that kind of market. But that should give you a good idea of sort of the relationship. Sorry about that, Jason. Go.
No, that's good. We actually had one more come in, and I think this would be an interesting question. I want to hear your thoughts on it. You know, throughout the pandemic, one of the things that I thought was really eye-opening was if you went to the grocery store and looked at the meat counter, most of the shelves were bare except for the alternative meats and our alternative protein sources. So the question is, what impact are we currently seeing, or would you expect for us to see in the future to beef prices as a function of some of these alternative proteins?
So I'm going to take a couple different attacks on this. One is, I'll just throw this out there. Nobody has to confess, but has anybody tried it? I haven't tried the one at Whataburger, not Whataburger, my God. Oh, I'm sorry. Burger King. I haven't tried that one, and mainly because I just didn't want to. But I did try one that it was called, it was a sausage. It was like an Italian sausage. They were doing free samples at the grocery store. So I looked around, made sure nobody I knew saw me, and I tried the sample. And I got to tell you, I thought it was terrible. The texture, it wasn't very good. I really see most of these as, and let's make sure I'm talking about the ones that are plant-based, not the cell cultured stuff, but the plant-based stuff. So we've had vegetarian burgers forever.
Yep.
This is the next generation of that. And so, those kinds of things have been here forever. I'm not sure that I really see those as a real big competitor. Really, I think it does, it's an alternative for people who want that. I think taste is important, and I don't think that has it. I also question in some ways the market, okay, so you might have someone who's a vegetarian and that gives them an option among everybody else. But boy, it's also more expensive. And as an economist, I think price matters. I think price matters more than anything else. And it's been more expensive. The price point is more expensive. There's a comment about Burger King quit promoting it. They actually put that thing on their sale menu, like their equivalent of the dollar menu or 3 for $5, just to move the stuff out the door, I think. I think people tried it and it was a big splash, and then sales drifted off. They are growing, but it's minuscule compared to beef. There's a lot of money beyond beef. There really is. I tend to think we've had very good beef demand. I don't think, really competitively, I'm not sure it's really there, at least short term. And I think also, I would throw this out too. Consumers have different motivations or different things they're looking for sometimes beyond just price or whatever. But, some of those, they have a pretty long list of ingredients. So if you're looking for something that's natural, something that is a simpler, cleaner, we call that label, a clean label. In fact, some of those things are GMO products. So depending on what you're looking for, those items might not really, the more you learn about them, they might not really fit the bill for what you're looking for, compared to something that is beef. There's really no other ingredient to put on the label, right? It's like butter, but butter is, butter, that's the only thing there. So, I guess you could say milk, but it's, different people looking for different things. I would probably argue that I don't think there's a whole lot of impact. I think beef has some real advantages, price being one of them. And they say they're going to get cheaper than beef, that they're going to get more price competitive. But, I think the only long-term issue is young people. And we know people's tastes and preferences change, and do young people like that versus something else? And so, I think I have some questions that way. I saw a really interesting study just came out. The Checkoff folks funded it by a couple of my colleagues. Glenn Tonzer's one of them, looking at some of these issues. And so with a survey of consumers and kind of competitive position versus beef. And I thought beef came out pretty good in the comparison, with some really, I think, important advantages.
I agree.
I hope that's a fair answer. I think that's what the research tells us, and just so far, at least the market research tells us. And just some thoughts as an economist, I think price matters more than anything else.
Yes, sir. I agree 100%. Well, thank you again, Dr. Anderson. It's always great to see you. Craig, I'm going to go ahead and hand this back over to you. But before I do that, I think Sonia has a few things that she needs to mention, but just a few points of clarification. So I don't know when you want that to happen or not, but just put that on your radar.
Okay, sounds great. I'm going to just start the slideshow again, but I'd like to thank everybody for coming out tonight. We really appreciate it in these different times, and I can see that that's still not. There we go. Maybe not. We really appreciate you coming out. As Jason said, that Sonia Joel is going to discuss for a minute a little bit about how these presentations are going to be shared in case you missed something. As always, I think the speakers provided their contact information, and I know I'm not speaking out of turn when I say feel free to contact them with additional questions that you may not have got answered. So we really appreciate everyone coming out. And Sonia Joe, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Craig. Just a quick update on what Marcy shared about the presentation and the recording. What I'll do following this session is I'm going to work with Bruce and gather the presentations. We'll email those out to everyone as a PDF, and we're going to send you a link to the recording in an email rather than posting on the website. It will be a little bit quicker as far as us being able to release that to you. When we do post on our websites, you know, we got to follow all kinds of rules and compliance and captioning and editing audio transcripts, which sometimes takes longer than we'd like. So the quickest way we'll be able to get everything out, like I said, would be email. And then again, we will post everything to the website, but it may be a couple of weeks before we're able to meet all the compliance guidelines for posting video. I'll post the website in text chat as well, but it is nmbeef.nmsu.edu, and we'll put a page off of that website. Thanks, Craig.
Thank you, Sonia. You've been a great help as always.
All right. Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Sonia Joe, for all the help tonight. We really appreciate it. All right. And with that, Bruce, unless you have Marcy, Jason, John Wenzel, I think he's on here as well. That's the sort of the organizing committee here. And I don't know, Bruce, do you have any comments before we wrap up the night?
Thanks to everybody. I thought it was a good night. So hope everybody can join us tomorrow evening and Thursday afternoon.
All right. And again, you can find, if you need somebody to register for that, the site that Sonia Joe just put in the chats, they can register there if they haven't, and the schedule and everything is there if you haven't received it. So please check it out, and we will see everyone here tomorrow night.
Take care.
All right. Bye. Thanks, everyone.